Miss Ambassador, thank you very much for coming and for this very first interview to the RFE. At the time you arrived in Georgia, the most popular, most discussed, it was more than a month ago, most discussed topic was the letters of congressmen, US congressmen, addressed to the Georgian Prime Minister. And the main topic there was the failure of Georgian Parliament to pass the changes to change the election system in Georgia to the full proportional one. And there were different issues like backsliding of the democracy, targeting of opposition leaders through different methods, questioning the independence of the Georgian judicial system, mentioning even sanctions perspective. Just very recently, Congressman Kinzinger, one of the authors of the letters, in his recent interview with the VOA, answering question if there will be no progress on the way towards the proportional election system, what would be the next step of the congressman? He answered it would be surprising for many. The decision on that will be made in the US, he said, though expressed some hope for the success. After all, I'm sure, and I was sure in the beginning when you arrived, there was a great interest. What would the new US ambassador say about all what is going on in Georgia? You hold numerous number of meetings. I follow your meetings. You also were in the US and came back, continued meetings, and also you got engaged very quickly in the political process, I mean as a facilitator to the political dialogue between the Georgian Dream and opposition parties. Do you think there is a genuine interest in having an agreement between the parties?
Well, thank you for that question. Let me start by saying how pleased that I am to finally be here in Georgia. It's something that I've been looking forward to, and of course it's a great honor for me to serve as the United States ambassador in a country that is such an important partner for the United States. You're right, I did arrive at a very interesting time and a very dramatic time in Georgia's political development. I think these elections in October are going to be very important. There's a great deal of scrutiny in my country and in other countries, and of course by Georgian voters, to see and to ensure that these will be free and fair elections. And I had a chance to read Representative Kinzinger's full interview with Voice of America, and I think his message was quite clear that the friends of Georgia in Washington really want to see Georgia succeed. And a success for Georgia is that the political leadership here can show the political courage that it will take to agree on an arrangement for the elections in October that all sides can agree to, that all sides can support. That is really what the parties have been working for here. And I have to say I've been very pleased to see the willingness of the governing party and the opposition parties to sit down at the table and discuss their differences, to negotiate their differences, and to try and find a solution that all can agree to and that really will advance Georgia's democracy and ensure free and fair elections. That is the essence of democracy, sitting down with your opponents and working out a compromise. So that is what we've been supporting, and I hope that's what we're going to see happen here very soon.
I don't think many people believe that without interference of the Western partners, of you diplomats, this dialogue would continue. Speaker of the Georgian Parliament, being still in the US with his official visit, said in the interview also to the VOA that our suggestion is 100 to 50, and that's final. If opposition wouldn't agree, then that will be the end of this process. But then we know what happened and what is going on now. There is still some hope, and Western diplomats got very active in helping this process not to stop and to continue. And also there was one very interesting moment when you invited Georgian politicians, and it was the 10th of February, if I'm not wrong, and civil society leaders, and we saw that the guests were just coming and leaving the place very soon, very quickly, and that was the day when the ruling on Gigi Ugulava's case was announced, and he went back to the prison. And I just want to ask, because that was my question, what was the situation inside? What your guests were telling you, like, hello, very nice to meet you, but now we have to leave because... So what was your perception then? What's going on in this country?
Well, it was my welcome reception, so I was meeting many people for the very first time, and as you mentioned at the start, this is an important and a dramatic time in Georgia's political development. That happened to be a day when something important occurred. You know, the United States has partnered with Georgia for many years and invested I think close to $30 million in helping Georgia develop its judicial system, to build in transparency, to build a more effective and credible judicial system. And we want to see rule of law here strengthened. Anytime there are questions or technical questions regarding judicial procedures, it undermines that credibility that you want your public to have in the judicial process. But I do have confidence that the work that Georgia has done to strengthen its judicial procedures will make the difference in terms of the long-term outcomes. We want to make sure that there are no shadows cast across the judicial process here or the political process here. And I feel that all sides in this, the opposition, the governing party, understand what's at stake when you try to have clean, fair, free elections and you don't try to politicize your judicial process. These things need to be kept separate. And that's what we're working with Georgia for.
Not only the judicial process itself, but we had a very disputable process of appointing judges last year to the Supreme Court of Georgia, appointing 14 judges, and one of them former, then present active Attorney General, and then he was replaced with the former chief attorney of the country. So it looks messy, but it's kind of clear process of trying to keep control of the power. So what would be your recommendation at this point, particularly when we are talking about judicial system and independence of the court system in Georgia?
We have made some additional recommendations to the government to try to make sure that the process of strengthening Georgia's judicial process and judiciary system continues. There is more work to be done, but it is important to take note of the steps that Georgia has taken. The fourth wave of judicial reform that was recently passed is a significant step forward by Georgia. And again, I think that comes with the investment in the partnership of the United States and others who want to see Georgia succeed and build a strong judiciary. It's so critical to have a credible judiciary, not just to make sure that Georgians are comfortable with the process here, but also to attract foreign investors and to build your economy. Because if an investor doesn't feel he or she can have a contract enforced or can have a dispute resolved in a timely fashion and in a fair fashion, they're not going to invest in Georgia. So that is the dual goal here. It's both to ensure that a fundamental pillar of democracy, a credible, transparent judiciary is in place, but also to attract more foreign investment, including, we hope, American businesses.
Sure. one of the opposition leaders, I want to go back to the political dialogue issue.
Okay.
Again, one of the opposition leaders, David Uspashvili, said that unfortunately we Georgians need to be invited to a dinner or a breakfast at the ambassador's residences to talk about our own problems. So why do you think the Western partners and diplomats should be facilitators of this process and not somebody else in the country? I mean, President, for instance, she also announced that she's ready, and she met you, diplomats, also facilitators to this process.
I think that really
discussed that.
I think that underplays the role of the stakeholders here. They have very courageously come together. They've shown a willingness to sit down together. We provided a place for them to do that. Mm-hmm. We've provided encouragement for them to continue what has been a very difficult process. I mean, that is democracy, and it's no easier in my country than in Georgia for different sides to come together and really have to discuss their differences, not only discuss them, but make compromises that are going to take political leadership. And that's, again, really one thing I have observed. There has been political leadership here by the governing party and by all of the opposition parties that I've talked to. They're taking this seriously, and they want to find a solution that everyone can agree to. But as I said, the definition of success here is an agreement that all sides can agree to and support, and that will last through the campaign this summer and beyond.
Do you see it is possible? I mean, there is another deadline set for the 9th of March, if I'm not wrong.
I think a decision needs to be made soon. If there is room for agreement, then the parties are starting to see that. If there's not, and I sincerely hope that they will find a way to agree on something that everyone can support, then that will be a very disappointing failure on all sides. I don't think anyone will be able to claim victory if there isn't an agreement reached. And I believe that is what Representative Kinzinger was trying to say as well in his interview. This is something he has to do every day at the House of Representatives in the United States. He knows how difficult it is, and it does take real political courage to come to a success in a situation like this. But I'm hopeful, I really am.
Civil society and media play a vital role.
Absolutely.
In supporting democratic process and in being alarmed all the time about some backslidings of the democracy in the country. And I know they also greeted and addressed you when you arrived, that they hope that you will help Georgia in keeping its democratic path. I would stop on the mediation, now media freedom issue. There are several criminal cases against media managers and media holders, different medias. And also there has been going on a very, I would say, dangerous process with the Ajara TV, public broadcaster, I mean. Since the former director was fired, the team of the company is trying to protect themselves, their rights, and their editorial independence. How close do you watch this process?
One of the first meetings that I had was a roundtable with representatives of the different media outlets here, because I do think it's crucial. We always talk about the three pillars of democracy being the executive branch, the congressional branch, the legislative branch, and the judiciary, but there's the fourth pillar, which is particularly important in any democracy, and that, of course, is the media. And having been a journalist myself early on, before I became a diplomat, I really value this. It's a fundamental American value to have a free and vibrant media that is unconstrained by political pressures. And I think that's essential here in Georgia or any democracy. The other side of that, of course, is that the media has to regulate itself by a code of ethics. And that was something that was instilled in me when I was in journalism school and university, and then as a journalist. And I think it's still largely true in the United States. That journalists have to self-regulate and abide strictly by a code of ethics and not become the spokespersons for different political parties, but, as you said, truly represent and present to the public a balanced perspective on important events in a country. So I am definitely engaged in this. I would like to be more engaged as I continue my time here in Georgia and learn more about it. It's concerning to hear some of these cases that sound as though there has been some pressure brought on media outlets. I can't say that I'm familiar enough with the details to go into great depth, but obviously it's just too important and too difficult in today's media environment, where you have bloggers and you have social media and you have disinformation and misinformation of a very virulent nature that is very hard to discern from the truth. And we're struggling with that in the United States. I think around the world, we're trying to figure out how we can ensure that the public is receiving accurate information.
Representatives of the ruling party mostly answering the criticism from the congressman would say that it's based on the information and on the activities of the opposition party leaders when communicating American politicians, and also the civil society. So what is, I know it's not enough time to evaluate, but what is your impression? What's the role of the civil society in Georgia? I know you met some of them and got familiar with them.
My impression is it's a pretty vibrant civil society here. And of course, when we're talking about civil society, we're talking about a broad range of organizations focused on many different issues. And in many of them, civil society is working closely with the government on things like education and environmental concerns, where there's very constructive work that's happening there. And I think that's as it should be. Now, it's not always going to be that way. Many times, it's civil society that is that takes the initiative that leads to legislation that improves society for all of us. I can think of one example in the United States, which was Mothers Against Drunk Driving, where mothers who had lost their children to drunk drivers in the United States drove a grassroots initiative that led to legislative change in the United States that has made our roads safer for all of us. So I think there are many cases where civil society can play an important and constructive role in improving society for everyone. And also in the political sphere, it's important that there is that politicians hear from all the voices in society. And Georgian civil society gives politicians information that they should be using to translate into legislation and maybe even campaign platforms. These are the issues that matter to Georgians. And I think that's an important role that civil society plays.
I would like to continue with talking about the American organizations, NDI and IRI. And they are very actively discussed the analysis and statistics they are giving to the Georgian society, especially when there is an important election coming close. And usually they are most criticized, and usually not only during this government, criticized most by the ruling party, and now by its leader, Ivanishvili. I know that the president of the NDI visited Georgia recently, and you met also him. What was the main issue, main topic of his visit? what was the purpose of this visit?
He was coming through the region. I recently
Okay.
also met with the head of IRI as well, who was coming through the region. As you mentioned, this is an important year, and everybody is watching Georgia very carefully because we want to see
Sure.
these elections be successful and be a role model for not just the region, but beyond that. So I had a very good discussion with Dr. Mitchell, again, about what NDI does. They are a very well-respected organization in the United States and have been for years, congressionally supported. Their work is relied on by not just the United States, but around the world as a neutral and balanced source of information that, again, politicians need to use this information to help them shape their platforms and their messaging. This is what matters to Georgian people. That is the purpose of what NDI and IRI are trying to do. And it's one of the reasons why they are so well respected, because they do it very well.
Yeah, but politicians not always like what are the results of and what the people are concerned the most about. Yeah. U.S.-Georgia relations, I know it's a huge topic and we would not be able to cover this in one interview. I would like to stress one issue. It's about the support, U.S. support, very strong support of Georgia's Euro-Atlantic aspiration. Last week, several comments of Georgian Foreign Minister David Zalgaliani were published in the Financial Times. And he urged the US and the EU for more and timely political and military engagement in the Black Sea region in the face of Russia's growing deployment of missiles on the Georgia's occupied territory of Abkhazia. The next day after that publication, Georgia's Prime Minister Gahari's opinion was published in Washington Times. Now is the time for NATO to answer our call for membership. Are any of the above statements discussed in Washington now? Is this something that was heard, or it was just...
Our commitment to Georgia's membership in NATO is steadfast. It hasn't changed. We stand by the 2008 Bucharest summit that Georgia will become a member of NATO. And of course, that means that Georgia has to do the hard work that it takes to meet NATO standards, which are quite high and very rigorous. I think Georgia is well aware of that and has made significant progress, particularly in the military sphere, of meeting the military standards that NATO requires of all its members. Now, there's a political side to becoming a member of NATO as well, and that has very high standards and expectations as well. And NATO, Georgia needs to continue to work toward achieving those. And the United States will remain behind Georgia. We are its most dedicated supporter, and will continue to be so because we have stood with Georgia in Afghanistan, elsewhere. We know that Georgia brings the capability and the commitment that is required to engage in international security efforts. And we are deeply grateful to Georgia for what it has done, its partnership in Afghanistan in particular, at considerable sacrifice, 32 killed, almost 300 wounded. Those are significant, meaningful measures that Georgia has taken in Helmand, now in Bagram. I think we are doing quite a bit with Georgia already in terms of training together. I just visited the Joint Training and Evaluation Center near Tbilisi yesterday and had an excellent briefing by the Georgian colonels about the facility and about Georgia's efforts to create a state-of-the-art training center that NATO allies and members can come to. Once again, seeing that Georgia is making concrete contributions that will pave the way to its eventual NATO membership.
I will go back to the Afghanistan issue a little bit later, yeah, sure. But First, I would like to talk about Russian threat, which permanently is presented on the Georgian soil. Its occupation accompanied with the borderization, people's kidnapping, and the total isolation of the territories which are occupied, isolation from the rest of Georgia. And it affects people's lives, and many people wonder, is there any leverage that could counter this reality which exists now in Georgia?
Let me just reiterate our steadfast commitment to Georgia's sovereignty and territorial integrity. This is something that, again, is unwavering. Russia needs to abide by its obligations under the ceasefire agreement. It needs to withdraw its forces, and it needs to stop these efforts at borderization. They're dangerous and they're completely unacceptable. I think the work that we're doing with Georgia to strengthen its capability to defend its borders, the increased cooperation on maritime domain awareness, which the foreign minister was mentioning. These are important deterrent effects that are projecting a message to Russia that I think is very important and I believe well received. Well heard, let's say. There's no masking what the message is there. And that is the kind of response I think that Georgia needs to continue to make.
I understand you're a diplomat and you cannot dictate anything to the Georgian government, but still, what do you think should be the policy of the Georgian government towards Russia? What kind of policy it should follow in dealing with the Russian occupation? And how far could, I know that many people are interested in that, how far could the US go defending its strategic partner in the region?
There is a mechanism in place, and that's the Geneva International Discussions. This is a conflict that is going to be resolved through dialogue and diplomacy. And I think as frustrating as that can be sometimes, as time-consuming as it can be sometimes, the United States believes that the Geneva International Discussions is the place to resolve this. Georgia, again, has shown commitment there. I think there's creative thinking going on. Some of the initiatives that Georgia has taken have been important. Outreach to the Georgian people in Abkhazia and South Ossetia to try to maintain those links and keep that communication flow going are very important. And I think Georgia is focused on doing that, staying in touch with its citizens in its country. Really, that is difficult, but I think that is very important.
There was planned Council of Europe ministerial in Georgia. It is planned, but not in Georgia anymore. And there was an issue of the Russian foreign minister whether to come to Georgia or not, how it will continue, and what kind of reaction would it receive from the Georgian society? Well, it's easy to predict the reaction of the society, but so the venue has been changed as far as we are aware, and it will be held. The meeting will be held in Strasbourg. There was an issue whether to let the minister to enter Georgia as he violated Georgian law on occupation. On occupied territories. So what would be the proper decision for that? Was it a good decision to change the venue of the meeting?
I mean, of course, it's for the Georgian government to decide. And if they have decided to keep it in Strasbourg, then I don't think that's unprecedented. I believe that's happened before. So there is precedent for that.
Different reasons,
And I think also Russia was not willing to make clear who they were going to send as the lead of their delegation. And that means that I don't see how the Georgian government could have allowed someone who has broken Georgia's laws repeatedly, completely ignored them by crossing in to Abkhazia. That puts Georgia in in the position of I don't see how they could have allowed that. So in the end, it's the government of Georgia's decision, but it's certainly not unprecedented to keep it in Strasbourg.
A cyber attack from Russia executed on Georgia last year showed the seriousness of the threat and the vulnerability of the cyber system of the country, security of the country. The U.S. Secretary of State pledged in his statement to support Georgia in enhancing cybersecurity. Why did it take 4 months, if I'm not wrong, since the cyber attack for making these statements and blaming Russia for the attack? Because the U.S. government was the first who published statement, and then the other partners followed also after the Georgian foreign minister's statement. Sure.
Well, that was a very serious cyber attack, and
yeah.
I think we are all around the world grappling with this new threat that is coming from many different sources and is not easy to unravel. So being sure, you want to be sure of the facts before you make an attribution like that. And it takes some time to be sure that you have, that you can say with confidence that this is what happened. And I think there was agreement by the United States, the UK, a number of other countries that weighed in after they saw the evidence that this was in fact a Russian hacking effort. We're all struggling to protect our systems. There's too much at stake for us not to work together to share best practices and lessons learned. And that's what Secretary Pompeo was saying. That's what the United States will continue to do with Georgia and with other countries, because we need to make sure that our systems are as secure as they possibly can be. And this is an ever-evolving effort. We will need to be working together on this, I think, for the foreseeable future.
As for the Black Sea security issue, which is becoming more and more important, not only for the Black Sea countries, but for the NATO, for the US. And that's why I mentioned that those comments of the Georgian foreign minister also in our interview. Also, in some terms, a deep sea port project was also perceived some kind of part of this security, not directly, but it's a commercial project, but there were discussions about that too. And we know that this project was supported by the US government. I mean, the statement of the Secretary of State, Pompeo, during the visit of the former Georgian Prime Minister. And does the US still support the project? And do you think there is a chance that the project may be implemented without the US investments?
We'd like to see more American investment in large infrastructure projects throughout Georgia, including Anaklia. I think it's a very promising initiative to build up that area. A deep water port for Georgia could be a big contribution to its economic growth. It has always served as that land bridge, as you know better than I, and I think there's a lot of potential there. So we're hoping that there will be opportunities for American businesses to invest not just in an Anaklia port project, but in other major infrastructure projects along the Black Sea, but elsewhere in Georgia. This is an area for opportunity between our two countries, I think.
Yeah, the security issue came because of the location of this port also. It's very close to the Georgia's occupied region. I'm going back to the Afghanistan issue. We know that several days ago the US signed agreement with the Taliban, peace agreement. And its goal is to have a zero military personnel in Afghanistan for the 2021. But it's a condition-based agreement, I know. Yes. What does the signing of this agreement mean for the US, for the NATO, and for the NATO's partners, like Georgia?
Well, as Secretary Pompeo recently said, this is the best opportunity for peace in a generation. This is what we've all been working for in Afghanistan with the Afghans, through NATO, through the coalitions that we've had, including Georgia's contributions to that, is to bring peace and stability to the Afghan people. They desperately want it, they deserve it, and this agreement, if the conditions are filled, is the best opportunity for that in a long time. But as you said, there are real conditions. We have to see if the Taliban are going to fulfill the security guarantees. And it's not, it's still fluid, and it's early days. I noticed yesterday that the Taliban had gone back to attacking the Afghan National Police and the Afghan army, so that undermines the spirit of the agreement and brings into question really what their true objectives are. So I think we have to keep an eye on this. The U.S. government will certainly be watching this very, very carefully. And we also want to encourage the Afghan government and the Taliban to talk directly and work out their differences, again, preserving the progress that Afghanistan has made over the last 2 decades. And I served there about 10 years ago. There were real gains being made on the ground for women, for children, in the healthcare area, in education, in civil society and the media. So we want to make sure that those are preserved.
Do you think it's the right moment for signing this kind of agreement?
I'm not close enough to say, but I believe Secretary Pompeo when he says this is the best opportunity for peace in a generation.
Yeah, because there is a criticism in the US also towards this agreement. Adam Kinzinger again said that, because the Georgian audience knows him now well, said that Taliban cannot be trusted. But at the same time, we have to also quote Defense Secretary Mark Esper, who said, "At no time we will relinquish the right of self-defense." So I understand that the US will be watching the process and the environment
very closely.
So I said in the beginning that when you arrived, the most popular discussed issue was the correspondence from the US Congress. But now I'm sure it's a coronavirus outbreak. And Georgia, like many other countries in the world, the US included also, is involved in countering this challenge. It is absolutely obvious now that the Lugar Center plays a very important role in having reliable information about the alleged coronavirus cases in Georgia. How would you assess the importance of this center and the state of the Georgia's healthcare system in challenging the particular situation? Because there were many questions, many myths about the center still continuing, coming from Russian sources to undermine and to make it suspicious for the Georgian society, because we know Russia doesn't like the center to be placed in Georgia and functioning.
I've been very impressed at the proactive response of Georgia to this coronavirus threat. When I came through the airport on Saturday, returning from a big Chiefs of Mission conference in Washington last week, I noticed the difference. When I got to Georgia, all of the airport personnel were wearing protective clothing and gear. They were screening patients carefully and thoroughly. It was a very forward-leaning response. And I think that's because Georgia has such a capable and professional operation in its National Center for Disease Control and in the collaboration with the Lugar Center. This is a research lab that has been here working on public health research for decades, as you know, and that collaboration, the value of that collaboration is now clearly evident as we face this threat from coronavirus. Georgia has really been a leader once again in its response, and I think Georgians should be very proud of the fact that the NCDC here, working with the Lugar Lab, have moved forward to keep the public health as a top priority. So I've been very impressed. The disinformation, I think Georgians are sophisticated enough regarding Russian disinformation tactics to see through the nonsense that has been perpetuated about the Lugar lab. I mean, it's just absolutely ridiculous. The lab is, again, public health research that is proving its value right now in a global crisis.
Iran is considered as one of the main possible sources of importing coronavirus to Georgia. And I know there are many questions about the situation in this term in Iran. And the US government also offered assistance to Iran. What's the result of that? I know that WHO team is on the ground there, but what about this bilateral cooperation in fighting coronavirus?
I don't have the details on what we offered, but I think the general offer and recognition that this is a global threat that we need to respond to as a global community. It rises above our concerns and our hopes for the Iranian people. It rises above our concerns about Russia and the Kremlin government, Mr. Putin's government. This is a global crisis that we need to face together. And I think that is the spirit in which the United States is offering assistance to Iran or to anyone who needs it right now.
About your visit to Washington, are there any messages that you would bring to the Georgian audience, or what kind of visit was that?
I went back for a global, all the global ambassadors around the world came together to meet with Secretary Pompeo, to meet with other leadership. We do this annually. It's a good opportunity to come together and hear from our leadership in the United States about the priorities. We discussed coronavirus. We discussed our national security priorities. I also had an opportunity to meet with some representatives at Congress, including Representative Kinzinger. And I would say that's where I had the most direct discussion about Georgia. We discussed the political situation here. We discussed our shared desire to see Georgia succeed in conducting free and fair elections this October. And again, I was, of course, one of our principal missions here at the embassy is to provide information back to Washington so decision makers are informed when they're making decisions, policy decisions about any country, Georgia, the region, and how it might affect U.S. interests.
May I have one more question?
Of course.
26 years and 12 assignments in 8 countries before coming to Georgia. You mentioned also about your journalistic past. Could you tell us more? How long did it last?
As a journalist?
Journalism, yeah.
I was a journalist for I went to journalism school. That was my specialty in university at Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern. In Chicago. And I was a journalist for a couple of years, and then I have to say my mother convinced me to go to law school, and I'm glad she did. I wanted to go into communications law at the time, and so I went to university in law school in Southern California. Practiced law for almost 10 years, and while I was practicing law, I became interested in the United States government, how we represent and explain America overseas, and how we make decisions about our foreign policy in Washington. And that inspired me to join the Foreign Service, become a diplomat. So I practiced both journalism and law, which were, I thought, a very good basis for becoming a diplomat, because they involve talking with people, they involve sometimes persuading people, knowing the difference between an objective fact and an opinion, which is very important, I think, in all of those. They're all self-regulated. All three professions require the individual to abide by a code of ethics that I think is very important, certainly to me, and that is part of American society as well, to hold your values, and for me, foremost is integrity and personal accountability. So I have been blessed with a wonderful career. I can't think of a better place to be now than in Georgia. I feel very, very honored that I've been given this responsibility by President Trump, and I'm looking forward to serving my time here, meeting Georgians and exploring your country.
According to your previous statements, I mean, before coming to Georgia, I understood that you were quite well aware of the situation in Georgia. And the very last question, what has surprised you the most since your arrival here?
The pace and the passion, I would say, of Georgians. I mean, there is a lot going on here. I mean, there's a real energy to move forward and keep this momentum that Georgia has built up over 30 years of real independence, developing your economy, and you do have a vibrant media, you do have a robust civil society, you're committed to making progress on strengthening your democratic institutions. We want to continue to be Georgia's partners in doing all of that. The United States has invested almost, I think, more than $4 billion over the past almost 30 years of our partnership with Georgia, because we believe in Georgia's success. We want to see this country become a stable, peaceful, prosperous, democratic, free market society. And I think you're well on your way to doing that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.